Welcome CSC103 to part 2 of our exercise 7, our HTML and CSS exercise, where we're just throwing a list of favorite shows with links. And we already did all our HTML. We have a H1, a heading 1. We have 2 paragraphs. We actually threw in just a div that's called break with an ID of break that has a space in it, so that's just what's here. And then we have an ordered list, which just has 1, 2, 3, because remember, unordered has bullets, ordered has numbers. And we linked our 3 items so that they open up in a separate window with a target of underscore blank and a href, a hyperlink reference of their address. So that's what we have. And what we're going to do is start formatting this, making the colors and fonts and layout, and we're just going to explore a little bit. This won't be anything that will look fantastic or anything like that. We'll just kind of experiment a little bit in our sandbox just to get the idea of how CSS works. And CSS works kind of separately from HTML. In the past, they used to put all the formatting inside these tags, and it used to get really confusing and really hard to find things and really messy to look at. So we're going to keep our CSS separate. So we can close up. And one thing we just have to be aware of is we need to know what our elements are. We have body element, which is everything, H1, which is our headline. We have 2 P tags, which are these, and they also have ID names, so if we needed to target just the first or just the second, we can do that. We can target this break, and then don't worry about that. I'll have you do that. That's just to help when we set up 2 columns. And then we can format our ordered list a little bit if we want to as well. If we want to change the indent, if we want to space it out a little bit, which we might do. And then finally, in the end, we're going to put a picture over here on the far right, and we'll do that. We'll do that at the end so that we can kind of use CSS to kind of move it over and style it. So we'll do that at the very end of our CSS. So what I'm going to do is move my CSS panel up to the top here and just move it in a little. I won't need it to be so wide. It won't be very much code. And we're just going to start with our first kind of declaration. And also, let me just point this out. I was just there for HTML, but if you go to W3 Schools, and I'll jump right there now, they do have a tutorial for CSS. And that'll give you all the terminology. Here they have the syntax. And this is all we need to know, this syntax right here. When you target, you basically target an HTML element, or it can be an ID, but for the most part, you're targeting an HTML element. And then inside 2 curly brackets, and typically we stack them like it shows down here. Typically we show here's a P tag, opening curly bracket, closing curly bracket, and then the declarations go inside, and you can see the way they are. They're basically using a property value. In HTML they were using attribute value with an equal sign and quotes, but this is using property value. So, and they use a colon and then a semicolon to end that particular one. And it does matter if you forget a semicolon. Sometimes not at the end, but if you have a list of them and you forget a semicolon, that could be a problem. So this is how it goes. Selector declaration. These are 2 declarations in 1 declaration block. And it's basically property value with colons and semicolons. And values all help you with the values. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of CSS stuff. I don't expect you to memorize it or know it, but we'll just go over a couple basic things just so you know what you can change with CSS. So back to our CodePen, I'm going to start with body, the biggest thing first. We always want to start with the biggest thing first and then work our way into more detail kind of stuff. So we're going to target body, and you don't have to put the brackets or the less than brackets on body. You just have to target body, and we're just going to put a opening curly brace. And there you can see, and it's a curly one, not a square one, and it puts 2 right away, and you could just hit return. And then right here is where you're going to put your CSS declaration. And then on the handout that I gave you a couple things that you could do. You could change the font family, the font size, and even the background color of this area, which is white to start. So this is all generic default HTML to start. So we're going to just start with font family. And the reason we use font family is we're going to give a choice, kind of first choice, second choice. So we're going to start with Calibri. And then I'm going to use Tahoma. And these are all fonts that people should have on their computers. And then I'll use Arial. But we'll use Arial 3rd because that's really common. We like, Calibri is a nice font. And you can see it's actually changing already. That's a sans serif font. There's no little feet on the bottom. It's not really a curly italic. So it's not the kind of type that you would read in a research paper or textbook or anything like that. And then for my last choice, I'm going to put sans. And this is kind of a generic thing, sans serif. That means without serifs, and that means it's this kind of font, a sans serif. So I'll just stretch this out a little bit so they go in one line. And I'm also going to change the font dash size, and notice that I'm putting a colon, and you don't have to put a space, but I'm putting a space. It's just easier to read. And for font size, I'm going to use, I think on the sheet I put 1.2M. You could use 1.2M, which basically means 120%. So if you just put 120%, it just makes it a little bit bigger. And let me, if you could just see the difference one more time, I'll go back. You see what happened? So 120% will just make it a little bit bigger, and that's everything. It's affecting everything right now. And then I'm also going to change the background color of my body, and it's background dash color. And I'm just going to put something generic CC, which should be a gray. And I don't know if you could see that being gray. So it's kind of a gray color right now. And I'm going to change that because I don't want it gray. I want a nice off-white. And instead of trying to figure out our hex colors, which we will do for the other one, I'm going to go back to, let's see, I'll go on this tab, and I'm going to go to somewhere called HTML color codes, my favorite color picker. My favorite color picker is htmlcolorcodes.com. But this one, and right, that's actually going, it looks like it's going to the last place I went. But if you come here and you're like, oh, well, it's all pink colors, just slide the hue up to kind of the yellow. If you want it a little more on the orangey side, you could kind of slide it in there. And then as you go down, it gets dark. As you go over, it gets kind of lighter, or almost kind of less saturated is kind of what it does when it goes that way. So I'm going to go over and kind of desaturate and get it real light. And there's a color right there. You could highlight it here, highlight it up here. It's showing you your hex. It's showing your RGB. And I'm just going to highlight this and copy it. And I'm going to go back to my CodePen and I'll paste it in here. Now you don't want two pound signs. And there it's kind of like a warm color now. So that looks nice. And that's all I need for body. So that's one declaration block for body. Now I'm going to move in. I'm going to target this thing. This is my H1, and I'm just going to change the font. Since I changed all the font back to sans serif, I'm going to change this font back to a serif. So I'm going to target my H1, which is the H1 element, and I'll put my curly brace and hit return. And then I'm going to do font family. And if you don't want to type font family again, then just highlight this whole thing. That way you don't have to retype it. I just copied, pasted, and we're going to change the fonts. I'll put Georgia, and then I'll use Cambria. And again, these are system fonts that almost everybody should have with, with Windows and Mac. And then I'll use, in quotes, I have to put Times New Roman in quotes. And the reason we do that is because there's spaces in the words. None of these other fonts have spaces in them. Whenever there's one word or two words in the font name, like New, like Century School Book, or New Century, or Arial Black, or anything like that, you have to put quotes. And then instead of sans serif at the end, it's just going to be serif. So that's the way that would look. And you can see it changed that particular font, and we're going to change the color of that font, and we're going to make that, and it's actually, you would think, would be font color. Let's see if font color works. And even if let me just make it white. I'll do FF, and nothing happens because there's no font color property. It's actually just color, believe it or not. When you're changing the font color, it's just color. So now it made it white. I don't want it white. I actually wanted a dark blue, and I actually asked on the sheet, see if you could make a dark blue out of just using hex of what you know. Remember, FF is R, FF is G, and FF is B, the blue. So if you put these at 0, then you get a regular blue. That's a bright RGB blue. And if you want the blue darker, then you could just take the FF and go down. And remember, they go down to F, E, D, C, B, A, and then down to 9, 8, whatever. So if you want to go down and just try like, AA. And there's kind of a nice dark blue. I'll even go down maybe one more, like 9, 9. And there you can see that's kind of a nice dark blue. And the blue looks nice with this off-white, kind of a cool, bold color. We have a lot of contrast going on. The cool kind of dark color with the warmish light color. We also have the serif font, which contrasts with the sans serif font, which gives a kind of nice look. It makes the headline stand out. You don't want to mix too many fonts, but you do want a little contrast going on. So that's all I'm going to do with the H1, I believe. And then I'll move on and I'll work on these paragraphs. And we're going to do a couple things with these paragraphs, and we just are going to target both paragraphs, so we could just use P. We don't have to use their ID names right now. And what we're going to do with paragraphs, we're going to do a couple things, but we're going to change the font color, so we could just go color. Maybe we'll make it a nice brown. I'll go to HTML color codes for that, and then I could stay within the same family. I'm already using this off-white. I'll just kind of move down here and find a nice color down here. That looks good. Copy it, go back, paste it. Now it's not working because it didn't take the pound sign yet. I'll put a semicolon at the end, and it is a brown. It's hard to see, it might be hard to see on screen, but it's kind of a brown, just kind of stays within the same family. And then a couple other things I'm going to change here with my paragraphs is I'm going to change the line height, which will kind of spread it out a little bit. So I'll go to line dash height. It's kind of like leading or line spacing, if you ever heard those terms, and I'm going to do them in percents as well. I'll make it 140%. And with a semicolon, and you see what happened, it spreads out a little bit. Like, if you can't see that, if you don't notice that, if I go to like 200%, it'll make it like double spacing, but that's too much. I don't need it that much. With percents, we can kind of go in between, so I'll put it at like maybe I'll put it 150 right now, which would be like 1.5. Make sure I have my semicolon, nothing else there. So it's 150%, and that looks good. And let's see what else we could do with the paragraph. We have, on our listing, we have things like width and float, but we're not going to do that yet. We're going to put we're going to put a float first. We're going to say float, colon, and then left. And what this does, just so you know, it makes one paragraph float left of, or it makes these elements, one each at a time, both of these, will float left of the other. And meaning they'll kind of get removed from HTML flow where they're typically stacking, and they could go side by side. Now right now it's not doing anything because they're block elements which go across the page, so they're not able to slide aside of each other right now. They would slide aside of anything like a picture. If it was there, they would move to the left of a picture, but we don't have one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a width. So these paragraphs have a specific width of, let's say, if I went 50%, it wouldn't work because there's actually a little bit of an extra padding or margin around the edge. Well, actually that is working, but it's real tight. So I might make it like 45%. That gives us a little more room, and still it's a little bit tight. And what I could do is even put some margin to the right of these paragraphs. Margin actually puts space outside the element, and we're going to use something called margin right. And I'll just use pixels, like 12 pixels as an amount. We won't use inches or anything, and you can see it moved it over. If I make it a little more, maybe I'll make it like 18. That moves it over a little bit. And these things are kind of cramped, but we're going to fix this because we have a problem here because of our float. What we have to do is we have to end our float, and it's still trying to put it aside of that. I mean, here it looks okay, but at certain times it's not going to look right. So what we want to do is actually put a little property here for our break. And if you look up back at our HTML, let me just move down. Our break has an ID of break, so it's div, and I'll show you how to write that to target break. You could actually target a couple ways. You could target just like this. You could put # break. That means an ID name of break. And sometimes I'll put the full name, and I'll show you what I mean. You could put break, and we're just going to put clear both. And what that does is it just kind of breaks from floating, and it keeps this what's ever after it from becoming part of that float. So we just do clear both. It could be clear right, clear left, but if we do both, that takes care of everything. And you could also put the word div right in front of it without a space. That's just kind of like the first name when we do div there, but I'm just going to take that out for now. It could either be div, break, or I could also use div because there's only one div on the page. So if there's only one div on the page, you know, typically we'll have more than one div, but if there's only one div on the page, so we could use 3 ways, but I'm going to use div # break to just keep that floating from happening to anything else. All right, one other property I'll put in here, or declaration, I'll put in for the OL, and I'll put my curly braces, and I'll just put one in for line height, and I'll just use maybe 150% for that as well. And you can see that'll just spread out our list a little bit. So let me take a break here, and then we'll finish up with our last part.